it is an important area for women to be writing about and have a voice in, because like in many ways environmental issues are women's issues. Right now, I think that most of the environmental writing you find, or most of the environmental writers you find, write about climate change in some way or at some point in their career. And that in particular, I think, really is a women's issue in a way, the same way that like reproductive health is. You know, the UN did a report a little while ago about climate change and talked about how, you know, it affects women more than men. You know, around the world, people who are affected by climate change tend to be poor. Those people tend to be women. In rural areas, women are affected by climate change more than men because they're responsible for things like cooking, gathering resources, food production, and all of the sort of negative effects of climate change in those areas fall more heavily on women. Similarly, like water scarcity affects women's health around the world more than men. That's an increasing problem with climate change. And then, you know, when you go out and you do environmental reporting, I think particularly sort of investigative environmental reporting, you'll often find that the people fighting against the negative impacts of these issues are women. You go out into communities and you find that women are often like some of the strongest voices against coal companies or natural gas expansion. You know, in my experience, now I'm a freelancer now, and so I do other things other than besides environmental reporting. But you know, a few years back when I worked in DC as an investigative reporter, I worked on a story about coal mining in Pennsylvania. And when we went out into these communities, some of the people who were sort of the strongest voices were like this woman, Rebecca, whose house was crumbling around her, or this woman Kim, who had a farm that she had bought to like teach her kids about, you know, like how to raise animals and like how to have a life connected to nature. And they were some of the only people who were still fighting against this coal company that had been ruining the land underneath their properties for decades. But sort of when you get back to the political side of it, I think that you find there are, you know, fewer women in decision-making power places. You know, I wrote a while back about some of the sort of like natural politics of natural gas expansion, and the people who you find talking about that, both on the corporate side and then similarly on the sort of activist progressive side, still tend to be men saying like, you know, this is sort of, we have to make choices, like natural gas is clean energy, but the people who are sort of driving the policy are still men. So, you know, there are sort of gender issues that you encounter when you deal with these issues all the time. I think that, you know, in the progressive sphere in particular, there's a lot of women writing about environmental issues who are like great examples. Kate Shepard, I write a column for the Media Consortium where I sort of have to read all these people every week, and like Kate Shepard and Mother Jones, Monica Potts at the American Prospect are great. There's a bunch of women at change.org who are doing great work on environmental issues. The managing editor of this awesome environmental magazine in California, Earth Island Journal, is a woman. So there's like lots of really great role models out there for people who want to be doing this, and might like want to be thinking about how to connect, you know, your feminist perspective with this work. You know, another thing to think about that I think about sometimes in the environmental sphere is that, you know, this panel is supposed to be about like things that are traditionally male beats, like, and I was like, well, what's a traditionally female beat? But I think it's like good housekeeping, I guess you might say, like food and clothing and household things. And I think there is a lot of that sort of work that happens for environmental reporters, or that can happen if you get more in the sustainability sphere. Like there's a lot of like green household products and like, you know, green makeup, yeah. So like it's sort of, there's a fuzzy area there, and I think that I've done some stories that are more over there. Like I've written about composting and CSAs in New York City, and the people who are doing that also tend to be slightly more female. I've never had an experience where people were like, you're a girl, so you should write about this, but I feel like it's possible that, you know, that would be something to watch out for. I think another thing about writing about environmentalism that could be an advantage for people who are coming from a sort of feminist perspective is that it is a sphere right now that people are coming to with a little bit more of an activist bent. So if you're used to sort of taking your opinions and matching them with objective journalism, you might be more comfortable with that in a way that other reporters aren't. So that could be an advantage. But we're seeing this more and more. Like some of the biggest voices on this stuff right now are Andy Revkin and Phil McKibben, and they were both sort of trained as objective journalists and are now doing much more activism work. But it's a place where if you sort of feel okay with saying, I'm not necessarily going to be 100% objective about my coverage, like I have an opinion and I want to bring this to that can be an advantage if you want to write about it. So that's sort of all right.
So excuse me because I'm fighting a cold, so my voice is not great. So my name is Dana Goldstein. I'm an education journalist. I'm a contributing writer to The Nation and to The Daily Beast. I'm currently doing a program called the Spencer Fellowship up at Columbia, so I'm working on a book proposal and sort of taking a break from a lot of magazine writing, but I have a blog, which is danagoldstein.net. So like environmentalism, education journalism has actually been a beat that has always had, I think, a lot of women interested in it because it deals with children's issues and women tend to be more interested in that. How I got started in it is that I grew up in a really interesting school district in a town called Austin, New York, which is upstate, and it was it remains one of the last districts to be pursuing a race-based busing integration strategy. So I grew up there, and I think it was only after I left there and went on to college and other places that I realized how unique it was to attend such a diverse and integrated school district. And that kind of set me on a path of taking a couple classes at Brown, where I went to college, about education policy and education history. And also my father and my grandfather were teachers. So I thought I wanted to be a political journalist, like covering campaigns and elections. And I moved to Washington after college in 2006, where I met Sarah, like within a couple days of arriving. And I started doing that kind of coverage, and I just found that it was substanceless. And I was on the campaign trail in 2008 for the Democratic primaries. And I was working at the American Public, which is a really great, small, progressive magazine. And when you work there, they kind of give you the freedom to choose what you want your beat to be within a policy area. And at the time, there was somebody doing foreign policy, and there was someone doing healthcare. And I was like, what do I want to do? And I realized that this interest in the public schools was like a thread throughout my whole life that I had never really fully kind of acknowledged. And that's how I got started covering public schools. How do you inform yourself about public education if you haven't studied it? Because I took 2 classes in it, and it was mostly from a historical perspective. So I was living in Washington, so I went to a lot of think tank events, and I read a lot of think tank papers, which I actually suggest that all of you do on whatever beat you're interested in. It's a good way to inform yourself. And I think probably the most fascinating thing to me about public schools is that they're a shared social institution and experience in American life, and we don't have a lot of those in our country. We don't have compulsory national service or military service, but 90% of all children in America do attend public schools, and that's just a huge number. And so it's a public institution that most people in society are incredibly invested in. And I think one of the funny things about being an education reporter is if I'm walking down the street and I meet someone and they ask what I do, I definitely have to stand all day tell me their opinions about public education, which is I think one of the problems in education journalism and education policy is that everyone has most people have a 13-year experience in the public schools, and they very much come at the issue from what that experience was. And that can be a big barrier to overcome in kind of building understanding around the issue. The challenges in covering education are, I think it's a polarized debate. in the media. On one hand, there's an obsession with elite education, private schools and college admissions in particular. And at big newspapers, there's like at least 2 or 3 reporters that cover the education choices and issues of elite and wealthy people. And then on the other side, there's a narrative of abject failure. So that's like the waiting for Superman narrative, that our schools are total failures and they've gotten worse and worse over time. And that's not true. I won't get into why it's not true, but the truth is in the middle of those 2 places, and unfortunately, the interest in being more nuanced is difficult to raise that interest among editors. So a lot of what I do is I look for public school programs that are effective at reaching disadvantaged children and have the potential to be scaled up. So for example, I did a big piece around Christmas time for The Nation magazine about Newark, New Jersey, which had been in the news because Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, had donated $100 million. And he went on Oprah and he was all over the media, and the narrative was that these schools were a total complete failure and that this rich guy from California who had no experience in public education was going to come in and kind of be the messiah that was going to save this school district. One of the things about New Jersey that's really interesting is it's the state in the nation that's actually closest to having a universal pre-K system, and that there's actually a lot of really good research out there showing that are leaps and bounds ahead of other states in terms of some things like early childhood literacy. So what I did is I actually went to public schools in Newark and I showed how there were some really good programs that were already existed, and that this was a district that had been the subject of cycles and cycles of reform over the decades, really since the 50s and 60s. And unfortunately, there was never an attempt to take the most successful programs there and scale them up, because every time a new funder came in, they wanted to start over. And since I wrote that article, they announced that most of the money is going to be used to start new charter schools, which is exactly kind of the problem that I was highlighting, which is that in the neighborhood schools in Newark, there are some great models for getting all kids to read by age 8, which is what the latest cognitive science tells us is one of the most important things that you can do for kids. And these kind of curricular classroom level learning kind of reforms are very rarely the subject of philanthropy and education. More often, the goal is to change the management structure of schools. And so that's something I try to address in all of my reporting. Lack of appetite among editors is a big challenge in covering education stories. If you work for a newspaper that has a geographic locale, like the Daily News or the Post or the New York Times, there's going to be several dedicated reporters covering the public schools because that's part of their mission to cover, the place where they are. But for magazines like the Daily Beast or Newsweek or Time or the Times Magazine or Slate or other places that I've had interactions with, it's very difficult to convince them to do stories around public schools for reasons I won't get into, but it's a challenge. Another challenge of covering education is it's becoming more and more difficult to get into traditional public schools as a reporter. Issues around parental and child privacy have become hot buttons in school districts, and oftentimes school districts will try very hard to keep you out of schools, and if they do let you in the school, they'll try very hard to keep you out of the classroom. I consistently overcome this challenge, but it's a huge headache, and I know to a lot of reporters new to the beat, it can be very intimidating when they say to you, every single child in the whole entire school you want to visit is going to have to bring home a slip to their mom and dad and have them sign it in advance of your visit. Like, this is something that you will hear regularly, and it's not true. If you don't reveal the children's names or identify the children by name in your reporting, there's no reason why they should have to have a permission slip. My practice is that when I speak to a child, I will email or find a way to contact their parents to ask them permission if I intend to quote them by name. But when I write about elementary schools, I do not quote children. They are not like very good subjects of quotes. Like you can write about what's going on. You can write about what's going on with children without naming them, and you can even describe a lot about them, and you don't always have to reveal their name. So there's lots of ways around these things. Obviously, if you go to high schools, you do want to talk. Like teenagers are very, very useful sources on their school experience, and that's something different. And I don't feel that a 16 or 17-year-old needs their parents' permission to speak to a journalist. But I think it's very important if you're trying to get into a public school, whether you report on education all the time or only occasionally, that you realize that you do have, these are taxpayer-supported institutions that ought to be open to the public. As long as you're sensitive to these issues around children's privacy and parental rights, those are real issues and you should be sensitive to them. I guess one thing I'll say about schools is I think there's 3 really interesting ways to look at them. One is as centers of community. I mean, schools, people feel very attached to their neighborhood schools. I think we see that a lot in New York with Mayor Bloomberg and Kathy Black trying to shut down failing schools. Even though those schools are failing, so they have low test scores, you'll still see that parents, teachers, and children want their schools to remain open, and they don't want to give up on their neighborhood institutions. So that's a very important story that's happening nationwide as budget crises force more and more school mayors and superintendents to make these difficult choices, is that you see a grassroots passion for keeping neighborhood schools open that I don't think is reflected in our national debate. A second way to see schools, and this is the dominant narrative in the mainstream media, is as places of achievement, strictly as places that produce test scores. This is 90% of the education you coverage sees looks at schools through that lens. Failing is defined as poor test scores, and success is defined as high test scores. And the third place, which is a lot of the work I do, is that schools are workplaces. They are the workplaces of teachers, support staff, and 80% of the people who work in schools are women. So I think a lot of the negative attacks on teachers that we're seeing nationwide right now, I don't think they're motivated by sexism, but I think we have a history in this country of lack of respect for teachers, and I think that is motivated in large part by sexism, and we're at this kind of like historical endpoint here where it's a relatively low-paid middle-class job, and yet there seems to be this incredible outpouring of resentment toward people who are doing this extremely difficult work. Very maligned and sad. There's always interesting gender stories about education. There's this thing, the boys' crisis, which is everywhere. You've probably seen it, which is the idea that, you know, boys have higher high school dropout rates and less college completion. That's true. So there's a lot of journalism that gets written about what's happening to boys. There's other issues that are less looked at that are really important. Girls' access to math and science and vocational pathways, which is still less than boys' access to those things. There are still districts around the country that are experimenting with single-sex education in a way that I think is pretty unsupported by research evidence. The ACLU does really good work tracking that kind of thing. And then I think a lot when you're talking about disadvantaged children, you're talking about single-parent households that are headed by women, and the roles that schools have in supporting parents is incredibly important. I guess in closing I'll say I don't find gender to be a disadvantage or an advantage in education. It's a field that's filled with inspiring women leaders from the policy level to the school level to the classroom level. There's no advantage to being a woman or a man in this field. It is an advantage if you're comfortable with children. And to me, being a feminist education journalist just means always looking at every story, not just through the lens of sex and gender, but also race and class. And with public schools, it's easy. There's a lot there. So that's all.
My name is Bryce Covert. I have written on finance and now I write on economics. So so that's what I'll be talking about. I got into all of that a little bit by accident. I was teaching, actually, and I thought that I would write on the side, and that's not actually something you can do because you don't really have free time. So I applied to a bunch of entry-level journalism jobs, and in New York, they pretty much all happen to be in finance journalism. I think partially because Wall Street, that's where we are right now. So I took an offer with an online newswire that covered mergers and acquisitions. It was investigative reporting, and in neither of these fields, there's no real advantage to learning about it that men have over women. But reporting on finance, there are definitely differences for genders. Finance in general is just really male and really white. As an example, one of the most important financial conferences of the year is Davos in Switzerland. The audience this year was 20% female, and that was up because they'd done some outreach the year before. It was 16%. That actually strikes me as high. I was usually the only woman in the room. It has its pluses and its minuses. I was covering energy and with another male colleague, and my sources were much more likely to talk to me and feel like I was harmless and friendly and comfortable. So in investigative reporting, that's a real plus. But the flip side of that is that I also ran the risk of it being taken the wrong way and being asked out on a date, and which happened a couple times. All of my female colleagues and I had to come up with tactics to avoid this. One of them wore a fake wedding ring for a while. I just made sure I wasn't meeting sources at night, and I was always in a public place, even though some of my colleagues would go out to drinks with their sources after work. All told, those kind of balance out in a weird way, and I think it is a level playing field if you want to get into it, but they're just these strange differences. I left that job and I moved to New Deal 2.0, which is the blog of the think tank, the Roosevelt Institute, that mostly focuses on progressive economics. Economics is also extremely male and extremely white. It's, as an example, women make up about 45% of med school grads and first-year law students, but they make up about 20% of the PhDs in economics. And that just means that the blogosphere, it tends to be similar, heavily male. Some of my favorite exceptions, Nancy Fulbright writes at the New York Times, Andy Lowry writes at Slate, Heather Boushey works at CAP and writes there. There's lots I'm not mentioning, but they are sort of the exceptions to the rule. So in both of these jobs, the way I got familiar with what I was writing about was by asking questions, which is what a journalist is supposed to do. And particularly in the one I have now, I ask questions of my colleagues. They're my best resource. And I have a thing where I feel like I want to be the expert when I'm a woman in a room full of men. I don't want to really admit that I don't know everything because it feels very vulnerable, but that's not really going to help me. My word of advice would be to admit what you don't know, and ask the questions and learn from your colleagues. And I have where I am, where I work with a lot of men, and they've taught me a lot, and it's been very valuable. The thing I don't have to do to write on these things is to take a class or to take some sort of formal training. Economics wants to think that it's a hard science, but it's not really. Sociology and psychology and human behavior are all really big factors in economic outcomes, in policy decisions. So your journalistic instinct is going to work the same here as it is in any other field you might cover. If something feels wrong to you, then you should look at what might be going on. Even if someone's got some sort of formula or data that they say proves their point, that doesn't mean that they've got the only point of view on the issue. Particularly, all the formulas that everybody thought were tried and true have kind of been either proven wrong or kind of turned on their head by the recession. So we're all starting a little bit from scratch now. And I think as a woman, as an outsider to this very male area, I challenge a lot of the assumptions that they all come into it with. A good example of that is the man session. when the housing market crashed at the beginning of the recession, manufacturing and construction were the first industries to be really hit, and so men had a really high unemployment rate. And so everybody called it the man session. It was a huge buzzword, and it was true that men had a higher unemployment rate than women, but no one was looking past that. No one was asking about what that meant for their spouses and for their families. No one was asking why all of a sudden we were really concerned about men's unemployment when we've been ignoring, to some extent, women's economic vulnerability for a really long time. No one was looking at what's happening to all the women who were laid off. I mean, they had a really high unemployment rate as well. And why there were so few women in construction and manufacturing to begin with. So I was asking those questions, and then now it's starting to reverse. The men are starting to make minimal but some job gains, and women are losing jobs, and both of those trends are set to continue. So, you know, I've been writing about that at New Deal 2.0. I wrote an article for The Nation. I know other people have covered it as well, and it's important to make sure we're talking about these things alongside what's happening to men. I think that feminism is a really good tool in covering this white, heterosexual, male area. You know, one of the goals of feminism is to talk about marginalized groups and bring them into the conversation, to challenge the assumptions. So I see that really informing the work that I do writing on it. The feminist blogosphere is constantly helping me. I'm reading that alongside all the economic stuff and making those connections. It was a Miss Magazine blog post that got me interested in the man session. They were talking about whether women would get left out of green jobs, and it just sort of clicked. And it's just important to have women talking about this topic. We are heavily influenced by economic outcomes. We're a very vulnerable group when it comes to this. The pay gap is 77 cents for a dollar a man makes, which means that we earn less over our lifetimes. Almost 14% of women are living in poverty. Elderly women tend to be very economically vulnerable. 12% of women over 65 are poor as compared to only 7% of men. So all the things that are decided upon in this area are really going to affect us. It's understandable to feel kind of turned off. There's a lot of experts in this field that say that they're right and they have these formulas, but you don't need to have a doctorate from MIT to think about, you know, if we slash Social Security, what is going to happen to these women that rely on it heavily for their incomes. You know, that kind of stuff, you can just use your journalistic instinct and figure out what's going to happen. And like any other topic, the more we talk about it, the more women's concerns are going to be mainstreamed into the conversation around economics. If I've inspired you to be interested in it, there are some really interesting resources out there. New Deal 2.0 has a Feminomics series where people look at the intersection of economics and women's issues. The National Women's Law Center does really important work on poverty and economic vulnerability for women, as does the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I use government websites to get a lot of data. They're actually pretty accessible. I go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor, and you can also email them, and they're very quick to respond and to help you figure out what you're trying to get to if you can't find it. And if you're not already following her work, Elizabeth Warren, who is interim head of the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as part of the financial reform bill, is doing really important work, and she's a good one to follow.
Okay, I'm Michelle Chen. Can you guys hear me if I talk this level? Okay. So I was just sort of toying with the title of this panel as I was trying to draft some notes, as I usually do when I'm procrastinating, and I thought about shifting the words around and talking about sort of redrawing the box, because I realized as I was trying to think of things to say that I don't really know what my beat is, and I often don't really know what box I fall into. So, and I guess it's interesting to me on an intellectual level how race, gender, and all these different categories sort of get sliced and diced, and in ways that can be both productive and also counterproductive in a lot of ways. And I think that, I mean, to the extent that I have a beat, I guess I've always had trouble sort of slotting myself into one, because I generally have always just written what I'm interested in, and I think that I guess I've been lucky enough to, in my experiences working either part-time or full-time doing writing, that I've never been under such financial pressure that I felt like I needed to find sort of like an access point in a certain market for a certain kind of journalism. So I guess I've been lucky that way. On the other hand, I tend to write sort of, opinionated columns, and so I guess it's not maybe the best model if people are more interested in pursuing full-time journalism as just a standard beat reporter. But I mean, to the extent that I ever gave the idea of feminist journalism a lot of thought when I was sort of first starting out writing, I think I remember when I was doing my first zine, probably the only thing I wrote about that had anything to do with feminism as a 14-year-old zine writer was something excoriating this this other zine called the New Girl Times. And I think in sort of my angstiness, I was really quick to dismiss feminism as something that was sort of and this was in the mid-90s, back when people like put out zines on paper, which were like this thing, sort of like blogs, but they were on paper, and people like photocopied them and they like read them like a book. So it might be before your time. So and I felt like feminism in some ways was sort of a movement, always searching for a cause, and I think it's because my exposure to feminism was generally through the lens of sort of rather privileged, middle class, often middle-aged women who were sort of bumping up against this abstraction of a glass ceiling, and I felt like it was really out of touch with different more grassroots movements that I was more interested in, because they were really about systemic social change. And I've only recently come back to feminism as a concept as a writer, after looking at some of those movements and seeing how gender is really often overlooked, or that gender is treated in a way that's really rooted in a lot of conservative assumptions about people and people's behavior and emotion, and I think that it's important to realize that you can write outside of the box, or you can write outside of your beat and take a feminist perspective to things without being necessarily explicit about it. And I think that one of the reasons identity politics becomes such sort of a toxic phrase and people want to get away from it is because it's often seen as a way to invoke a kind of, I don't know, like a sort of a reverse kind of privilege, and something that people can fall back on. When they don't really want to be held accountable or engaged at an equal level with more privileged people in debates that have a broader reach. And so I think going back to the whole issue of ghettoization versus creating safe spaces, I think that's something that all women journalists and all journalists in general have to sort of wrestle with. And one of the things that the web has done is it's really diversified journalism in a lot of ways, both in terms of how we think about journalism as a genre and as a profession, and also in terms of content. But it's also created these silos and these different kinds of barriers and tiers that I think might end up undermining what we say we strive for when we say I'm a feminist journalist, or I blog about race, class, and gender, and things like that. Just by way of background, right now I cover, I write this column called Global Justice for Color Lines, which is sort of looking at human rights issues and international issues from a race angle. And that's been pretty enlightening, because I realize that so much of our discourse around race is often not from a global standpoint, and a lot of these sort of global economic justice activism has really been dominated by this kind of anti-corporate rhetoric that is very much rooted in sort of the like 1990s anti-sweatshop campaigns, which does have a lot of resonance, but at the same time it doesn't really connect struggles of people of color in America with struggles abroad that do turn on issues of race and imperialism and global capitalism, things like that. I also cover, I contribute to In These Times, and they have a workers' rights blog called Working in These Times. And one of the interesting barriers that I've run up against that is that I often try to introduce issues of race and gender into the discourse around labor. And very often in labor journalism, it's always framed around somehow the labor movement is equated with unions in this country, and that and that alone really kind of militates against looking at labor as a gender issue, because women workers are usually excluded from the discourse around unions, especially mainstream unions that are very often led by men, have majority male memberships, and are often kind of rooted in this kind of this sort of political framing around notions of brotherhood and sort of male chauvinism and oftentimes jingoism that generally isn't very kind to women or people of color or youth for that matter. And one of the things that I think when you do cover a movement, even from on the left, especially if you're on the left, that movements really have to interrogate their own the tiers of privilege that they've carved out within themselves. And another thing is that you can approach gender issues even as a woman in ways that you don't even really notice sometimes, and it's important to notice when gender is an issue, but oftentimes it's okay to just let your perspective be your perspective and not be hyper conscious of the fact that you are a woman writing this at this or that moment. Always, like, I worked for, I helped launch an online news publication called The News Standard back in 2004, 2005, and almost everyone on staff was a woman, but most of the time we were just busting our asses trying to put out content. We didn't have long discussions about what it means to be a mostly female news collective in a mostly male and white dominated profession. And right now I also co-produce a radio show called Asia Pacific Forum, and almost everyone in the collective, with the exception of one, is a woman. And we do talk about gender issues, but we don't necessarily frame ourselves as a feminist collective. I don't think we don't do that at all. I don't know if that's necessarily, some people may choose a different tack on that, but I think it's more important that the conversation around women and that women's visibility is mainstreamed in some ways, even though creating safe spaces is also important. And I also think that sometimes it is important to notice when you're the only woman in the room, and that's often when the issue of gender is really coming to my face, and or even when I'm not the only one in the room, what I'm expected to represent when I'm invited to a certain forum or something. I think I testified at this, I spoke at this NGO side panel at the UN Conference on the Status of Women about sex workers, and I realized that everyone on the panel, I think almost everyone on the panel, was either a female academic or a woman journalist, and there was no one who had actually ever engaged in sex work or had any direct experience with the sex work sector. And that sort of gave me pause, because while I felt happy to be able to speak on that issue with some authority, I felt like something was really missing about not having that voice there, and somehow it was enough to have a female journalist kind of stand in for the subjects that we cover, when that is not generally an approach that's taken with male journalists. Somehow we're expected to empathize with our subjects or identify with our subjects or represent them in some way that men are generally not expected to do, and that could be a good thing. I'm not anti-empathy or anything like that, but I think we should all sort of question why people read female journalists with those types of assumptions in mind. And so I think, I guess to close out, I think it's important just not to try to, if you are in a situation where you find yourself writing on a certain beat, whether it's as a woman or a woman of color or whatever, don't necessarily try to be your beat all the time. There is this, I think, kind of a sense of a burden of representation that a lot of journalists take on, especially if they're covering movements, especially if they're writing from a leftist perspective, that I think is helpful in some ways, but also needs to be challenged from within, I think. Even if you sort of gain some pride and notoriety for yourself by taking on a certain angle on everything that you write. If you just write that one thing, then you're not really broadening the conversation, and you might find yourself in a position where you're not reaching out to constituencies or readers that most need to hear what you have to say, and you also risk sort of being tokenized. And I think it's important to remember that most consumers of media are not single-mindedly focused on consuming only media on one type of issue, and unfortunately that seems to be the way a lot of journalists work, and it seems a little bit unnatural and sort of strange to me. So if you're lucky enough to be in a position where you can write freely about things that you're broadly interested in, that doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that you are bringing a certain kind of voice or a certain kind of identity to the field that you're writing on. I remember when I was writing something for Global Justice on child soldiers, I was sort of wrestling with it because I was like, well, what is the racial justice angle on child soldiers? Where is the inherent sort of racism in child soldiers that I need to sort of parse out and present to the readers? And then my editor just basically told me, not everything you write needs to have this glaring kind of race angle to it. Often it can just enlighten an issue that people who are also interested in issues of race and gender and class and privilege and things like that would find enlightening. That's another way to approach it, just from a reader's perspective. What is the best way you can engage with people? And there are ancillary effects to that involve making them more acclimatized to talking about issues that go along with that particular issue, which might include feminism, or might include youth, or might include organizing. So I guess it's important to think about writing outside the box, but also to think about broadening the box itself.